In every dynasty there's someone who holds the secrets, not by blood, but by signature. Richard Hale had walked through the Westbourne gates more times than he could count. Not as a guest, not as family, but as their lawyer, their fixer, their shield. He knew where every document was buried, every codicil hidden, every whispered amendment never made official. Over 30 years, he had drafted 4 wills for Patriarch Alistair Westbourne, each more tailored than the last. To assets, to heirs, to image. The Westbournes weren't just rich, they were curated. Their family tree appeared often in magazines, never in court. And Richard Hale, with his pressed suits and calm voice, made sure of that. When Alistair died, the call came at 4:12 a.m. A butler with perfect diction, informing him of Mr. Westbourne's passing in his sleep. Richard was already dressed before the call ended. The mansion was silent when he arrived, save for the soft clicking of clocks, a reminder that time moves forward, even when legacies try to pause it. Richard was handed a thick envelope by the estate manager. Inside, the last will and testament, dated 6 months prior. It wasn't the last one Richard had drafted. He paused in the hallway before entering the study, his breath shallow, because 3 weeks before Alistair's death, Richard had met him in this very room. Alistair's voice had trembled for the first time. His hand shook as he signed a document that no one else knew existed, a revised will, one that named a woman Richard had never heard of before. "No lawyers," Alistair had said. "No notaries. Just you and me, Richard. You'll know what to do." He had placed the new will in a separate envelope, sealed it in red wax, and placed it in the back compartment of the safe. Now, standing in the same study, Richard reached for that envelope. He opened the safe. The red seal stared back at him, and he realized the dead man had left behind not just an empire, but a decision. Every fortune hides a name the family hopes the world will never learn. Richard stared at the sealed envelope in his hands. The wax, still unbroken, bore Alistair Westbourne's personal insignia, a falcon over a twisted crown. It was unmistakable, undeniable. He closed the safe, locked it, and sat at the massive oak desk. Then he lit a match, but didn't strike it. Instead, he opened the envelope carefully. Inside, the new will, signed, dated, but unnotarized. Risky, questionable, but legal, if the executor chose to make it so. And then her name appeared. "To Ms. Evelyn Rhodes, I leave the Westbourne Hill estate, along with all assets tied to the property, including the vineyard, the guest houses, and the private art collection." Evelyn Rhodes. Richard had never heard the name before. She wasn't mentioned in the old will, not in the dozens of versions he'd drafted over decades. Not in the footnotes, not in the family's whispered scandals. She was no one, or someone Alistair never intended to explain. The original beneficiaries, Alistair's children, were set to receive everything: the company shares, the properties, the family trust. This change rewrote the legacy. It didn't just adjust the distribution, it erased them from the part they valued most, Westbourne Hill. Richard leaned back in the chair, his breath shallow. He had been loyal to this family longer than some of the heirs had been alive. He watched them grow from tantrums to trust funds. He knew what they were made of: charm, cruelty, and champagne. And still, Alistair had chosen someone else. The question wasn't, why her? It was, why now? A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Abigail Westbourne, Alistair's eldest daughter. Immaculate posture, cold eyes. "Richard," she said, "we've gathered in the sunroom. You'll read the will soon, won't you?" He nodded. "Yes, I will." But he hadn't decided which one. Not every flame is lit with matches. Some begin with silence. Richard stood in the hallway just outside the sunroom, the envelope trembling slightly in his coat pocket. Inside, the Westbournes waited, polished, rehearsed, and already imagining their shares. He remembered the rehearsals well. Alistair had rewritten his will 5 times in the last 3 years. Each version was a dance. Give Abigail the vineyard, then take it away. Add Thomas to the company board, then demote him to a mere shareholder. He watched it all, never judged, only drafted. But this version was different. Evelyn Rhodes wasn't just a name, she was the change. Richard walked past the fireplace in the study where the old documents still rested in a locked drawer. The official will, the one everyone expected, was ready for presentation. But it was also outdated, a lie, and yet it felt safer. He lit a fire anyway, not with Evelyn's will, but with his certainty. Because Richard, once the family's most loyal servant, now sat at the center of an impossible question. Do I honor the dead or protect the living? When he entered the sunroom, the mood shifted. The heirs were seated on velvet chairs, crystal glasses in hand. Grief performed like theater. The air smelled of citrus and expectations. Abigail stood. We're ready. Richard took out the will. Not Evelyn's, the one before. He began to read. And as he spoke each word, words he'd typed himself, knowing they were now false, he felt a kind of nausea take root in his gut. The kind that comes not from food or drink, but from watching a truth die quietly in your hands. But they smiled, nods, tears, even applause from Thomas. No one questioned a thing, except Richard, because the ashes of the new will still smoldered in his fireplace, and somewhere, a woman named Evelyn would wake up the next morning thinking the world had changed. She just didn't know that, in this world, truths can be buried before the dead are. Some inheritances are erased before they're even written. Evelyn Rhodes lived in a modest apartment 2 towns over. No garden, no estate, no family crest on the gate, just a balcony with plastic chairs and a wind chime that had lost its melody. She hadn't seen Alistair in months. But she knew, deep down, he was preparing something. He always had a way of disappearing when he was working on something that mattered. What she didn't know was that she'd already been written into his legacy and erased from it in one silent evening. On the morning of the will reading, she dressed carefully, not with expectation, but respect. She wore the necklace he gave her, tucked beneath her blouse. It wasn't gold, it wasn't even valuable, but it was his. She arrived at the estate gate. They didn't let her in. The guard checked the list. Her name wasn't on it. She smiled politely, waited a few minutes longer than she should have, and left without a scene. She didn't cry. Not there. But the silence in the taxi ride home was heavier than any insult. At the Westbourne estate, Richard pretended not to notice her absence. He couldn't risk it. Every word he had spoken that morning came from the wrong will. Evelyn would never know, unless the letter reached her. Because there had been one. Alistair had written it by hand. Richard remembered the ink smudges, the phrase, "You saw the man behind the suit." He'd kept the letter in a separate envelope, hidden in his desk drawer. Richard went home that evening, poured himself a drink, and stared at the drawer for hours. Inside was the letter, unsent, unread, unforgivable. The next day, Evelyn lit a candle in her kitchen, quietly, alone. She whispered goodbye, unaware that she had been remembered, just not honored. Because sometimes the cruelest inheritance isn't what you don't receive. It's not knowing you were meant to receive it at all. Some truths don't die, they're burned. The morning after the will reading, Richard entered his office before the sun rose. The city below was silent, unaware of the crime committed under golden chandeliers. He opened the bottom drawer of the oak cabinet, the same one his father once locked with trembling hands after signing his own legacy away. Inside, the real will. Handwritten, sealed, initialed by Alistair Rhodes just 3 weeks before his death. It was different, drastically. No shares for Caroline, no trust fund extensions for her daughters. And Evelyn? Not just acknowledged, but named. To Evelyn Rhodes, who walked beside me when the lights were off and the crowd was gone, I leave the Westbourne cottage and 20% of my liquid assets. Richard stared at the paper, his pulse steady, his hand not. The forged will had already been executed. Witnesses, notarized, filed. Undoing it meant exposing everything, including himself. For 3 decades he had been the executor of legacies, the keeper of secrets. But that morning, Richard realized he had crossed a line even he couldn't legally justify. He didn't speak, he acted. He tore the envelope in half, lit a match from the fireplace, and dropped the truth into flame. The parchment curled, ink turned to smoke. A life's last wishes, erased in seconds. The scent of burning vellum lingered. It stuck to his suit, to the walls, to the very air of the room. He opened a window, hoping to chase the guilt out with the smoke. But guilt doesn't leave through windows. It waits, in letters unsent, in eyes like Evelyn's, in questions no one dares ask. By lunchtime, Richard had rewritten his day's agenda. Deposits, meetings, nothing unusual. But his reflection in the elevator doors told a different story. He'd preserved a lie, protected a family that never thanked him, and buried a truth that wouldn't stay dead. Because even ashes leave shadows, and some fires leave smoke that never clears. You can burn a will, but not a conscience. 3 weeks passed. Caroline redecorated the estate, replaced the mahogany furniture with glass and chrome. Evelyn was offered a token check out of decency, which she quietly refused. Richard kept his head down, his routine pristine, until the envelope arrived. Handwritten, no postage stamp, no return address, just his name. Inside was a single sentence: "There's a truth ticking behind the time you stole." His blood chilled. He knew exactly what it meant. He drove that night to the Westbourne cottage, technically now Caroline's, legally untouched by the new will. But it had remained locked, unused, unseen. He had the spare key. Of course he did. The cottage smelled of cedar and forgotten memories. Dust coated the books. The grandfather clock stood by the fireplace, just as Alistair had left it. Richard opened the back panel, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but recognition. Inside was a second envelope, aged and yellowed. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just sealed. He opened it, a confession in Alistair's handwriting. One Richard never expected and couldn't deny. It revealed everything. The affair that brought Evelyn into the family. The guilt Alistair carried for never publicly acknowledging her. His final attempt to make it right in a legal addendum, and his fear that Caroline would fight it to the grave. His plea to Richard: "If I cannot protect her in life, at least let my truth reach her in death." Richard sank into the armchair. A lawyer who built empires on facts, now undone by a single truth, hidden in wood and time. He could still fix it. Still amend the forged will. Still tell the court. Still lose everything. He put the letter back, closed the clock, and left the house, locked once more. That night he dreamed of Alistair's voice, not angry, just disappointed. And in that silence Richard finally understood. The law protects estates, but truth, it protects nothing, and still demands everything. Silence can buy time, but it can't outrun truth forever. Months passed. The estate was officially closed. Caroline grew bolder in her circles, philanthropy galas, society interviews, designer donations made in her name. Evelyn moved out of town, renting a small flat above a flower shop. She never spoke of the inheritance again. And Richard? He aged 10 years and 6 months. The firm noticed. His hands shook in depositions. He fumbled during a high-profile merger. But what no one saw, what he hid even from himself, was the steady erosion of self-respect. Until the journalist arrived. She was young, persistent, and alarmingly well-informed. "I'm writing a piece about the Bellamy estate," she said, recorder already on. The original will was rumored to be more balanced. Richard kept his face still. Years of practice. "I don't comment on client matters." "I understand," she smiled, "but someone left a photocopy of a letter in my inbox, one signed by Alistair Bellamy." Silence. "Then would you like to see it?" She placed it on the table between them. It wasn't the original, but it was enough. His heart hammered. He reached for the paper and paused. He could deny it, claim forgery, dismiss her as a conspiracy blogger. But his own words echoed back: "If I cannot protect her in life, at least let my truth reach her in death." For the first time since the fire, Richard didn't calculate. He confessed. Not everything, not yet, but enough for the journalist to sense the story behind the scandal. By morning, the news spread. Burned will, buried truth, Bellamy legacy under scrutiny. Caroline went silent. Evelyn was contacted for comment. And Richard? He walked into his firm and resigned. No press conference, no tears, just a quiet walk through the lobby, past the portraits of men who built fortunes on paper. As he stepped outside, he felt the wind cut through his coat. Cold, honest, unforgiving. But for the first time in years, it didn't sting. Because some legacies aren't protected by fireproof safes. They're carved into what we do when no one is watching. And Richard Bellamy had finally let the truth watch him back. Sometimes justice doesn't sound like victory. It sounds like nothing at all. The media storm passed faster than expected. No trials, no dramatic courtroom showdowns, just whispers, archived articles, and one name quietly removed from society guest lists. Caroline retreated to a villa in the south of France. Her lawyers advised silence. Her friends, fewer than she'd imagined, stopped inviting her. She faded, not with disgrace but with irrelevance. Evelyn didn't gloat. She never issued a statement. But one morning she received a package. Inside, a velvet box. The family ring, not the replica Caroline had flaunted. The real one, its crest dulled with age but intact. No note, no explanation, just the heirloom returned. She wept. Not for the ring, but for the years it represented. The birthdays missed, the laughter replaced by lawyers, the truth hidden behind polished lies. She wore it once, then locked it away. Some symbols hurt more than they heal. And Richard? He disappeared from law. Rumors said he worked at a bookstore up north. Evelyn never tried to find him. She figured he wouldn't want that. But every Christmas a card arrived. No signature, no message, just one line. Some truths deserve to be held, not told. Evelyn would stare at the words. Not angry, not vindicated, just quiet. The Bellamy estate was eventually sold. The portrait halls emptied, the gala invitations stopped. But in that space, something softer took root. A new foundation, Evelyn's own, focused on truth, on rebuilding, on listening to those who had no voice when the wills were read and rewritten in secret, not for revenge, but for legacy. And one winter evening, as snow gathered on her window, she whispered to herself, "He burned the will, but not the truth." Because the truth, like ashes, always finds its way into the light. And some inheritances aren't money or land or rings. Some are the silence we choose to break, and what comes after.